Rain pounded against the windows, a relentless rhythm that echoed the storm raging inside me. The world outside blurred through the streaks of water, as if even nature itself refused to witness the cruelty of my reality. I stood frozen, my fingers clutching the edge of the wooden railing outside Brandon's study, my breath caught in my throat. "Do you even love Leah? Do you really want to marry her?" The words slithered through the crack in the door, sending a chill down my spine. The voice was deep, familiar, it belonged to one of Brandon's closest friends. Brandon, my devoted fiancé, the man who had sworn his love for me time and time again, sighed heavily. There was a pause, long enough to birth hope in my chest, but when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with an unsettling certainty. "This is the only way Mia can be happy." The air left my lungs. My world tilted. My fingers dug into the wood as if anchoring myself to something solid, but nothing felt real anymore. His friend exhaled sharply, as if already exhausted by the truth. "You're so devoted to Mia. You've loved her in silence for years. Even knowing she was in love with Adam, you let her marry him without a word. And now you've taken Adam's fiancée just to make her happy. But at what cost, Brandon? You're giving up your own happiness." Brandon's response was immediate, filled with the same blind devotion he had always showered upon me, or so I thought. "As long as Mia is happy, I don't care what happens to me." A sharp pain pierced through my chest. My vision swam. My breath came out in shallow gasps, as if the weight of his words had crushed the air from my lungs. Brandon had never loved me. 7 years of his so-called devotion had been a lie, a carefully crafted illusion meant to keep Mia content. He had pursued me, not because he wanted me, but because I was an obstacle in Mia's path to happiness. And now, believing he had succeeded in removing me as a roadblock, he was willing to bind himself to me in a marriage built on deception. The realization struck like lightning, swift, merciless, and irreversible. I turned on my heel and fled into the night, the rain drenching me as I ran blindly down the empty streets. The city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of betrayal and heartbreak. My body trembled, but whether from the cold or the sheer devastation, I couldn't tell. I had spent 8 years chasing Adam, hoping that someday he would turn around and see me. And when I had finally given up, exhausted by unrequited love, Brandon had appeared like a beacon in the darkness, offering the love I so desperately craved. And now, that love, too, had been nothing but a mirage. I laughed, the sound bitter and hollow as it was swallowed by the storm. No one had ever loved me. Not Adam. Not my parents. Not Brandon. No one. That night, as the rain poured down and the cold seeped into my bones, I made a decision. One that would change everything. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady despite the turmoil inside me. A few minutes later, a voice on the other end confirmed what I had long been planning. "Miss Leah, your purchase of the private island has been successfully processed. It's completely secluded, and no one will be able to find you there. The customized family you requested has also been arranged. They're professionally trained to provide you with unconditional love and care." I inhaled deeply, my voice barely above a whisper. Okay. 30 days. That was all I needed to tie up loose ends. And then, I would disappear. From Adam. From Brandon. From my parents. From Mia. From the entire world that had never cared whether I lived or died. For the first time in my life, I would belong to no one but myself. The next morning, the sun shone mockingly through my bedroom window, as if the universe found amusement in my suffering. I moved through my apartment in a daze, collecting the necessary documents I needed to finalize my departure. I had meticulously planned every detail, canceling my household registration, transferring my remaining assets, and ensuring there were no traces left behind that could link me to my past life. But one crucial document remained at my parents' house. And so, with no other choice, I found myself standing before the home I had long abandoned, the place that had never truly felt like mine. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the weight of years of neglect pressing down on me. My parents stood in the living room, their expressions turning sour the moment they saw me. "Why are you here?" My mother's voice was sharp, laced with impatience. "You haven't been home in years, and now you suddenly show up? Why can't you be more like Mia? The two of you are sisters, but you're worlds apart." The words should have hurt. Once, they would have. But now, they barely left a scratch. I had heard this too many times before. Without a word, I walked past them and made my way upstairs. I retrieved the document, tucked it safely into my bag, and turned to leave. But my silence only seemed to infuriate them more. "Do you even see us as your parents? You ungrateful, disrespectful child." Before they could hurl more accusations, the front door suddenly swung open. Brandon stepped inside, carrying Mia in his arms. Time seemed to slow as I stood in the foyer, my gaze locking onto them. Mia's arms draped around his neck, her face nestled against his chest in an all-too-familiar gesture of possession. My parents' anger dissipated the moment they saw her, their focus shifting entirely onto her well-being. "Mia. What happened? Are you okay?" My mother rushed forward, concern evident in her voice. Brandon, noticing me for the first time, immediately tried to explain. "Leah, don't misunderstand. Mia sprained her ankle, so I carried her home." Mia smiled sweetly, her voice soft and laced with false innocence. "Adam has been away on a business trip lately. If he were here, I wouldn't have troubled Brandon. Sister, please don't take this the wrong way." Her words, her tone, her very presence were all calculated. A performance, perfectly executed. I remained expressionless, offering nothing in return. But Mia wasn't done yet. Her eyes sparkled mischievously as she added, "Oh, Brandon, thank you so much for running through 10 red lights just to get me to the hospital. I know I've troubled you too much." She sighed dramatically, then looked at me, waiting for a reaction. When I gave her none, she frowned. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't playing their game anymore. Mia had stolen everything from me. My parents' love. Adam's heart. And now, even Brandon, the man who had promised me forever, had belonged to her all along. But none of it mattered anymore. Because in 30 days, I would be gone. For good. The moment I stepped out of my parents' house, the suffocating weight of their words still clinging to me like invisible chains, I made a promise to myself I would never return. The air outside was crisp, the world oblivious to the chaos in my heart. The sky stretched out before me, vast and endless, a reminder that somewhere beyond this city, freedom awaited. And yet, for now, I had unfinished business. 30 days. That was all I had to sever every remaining tie. I clutched the document tighter in my hand as I walked away from the house that had never been my home. The distant sound of my mother's voice scolding a maid about Mia's favorite meal rang through the air, a final insult to my existence. Not that it mattered anymore. Brandon insisted on driving me home. I had no interest in being alone in a car with him, not after what I had overheard the night before, but refusing him would only raise suspicion. As we drove, the silence between us thickened. He kept glancing at me as if searching for something, but I gave him nothing. "Leah." He finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Are you okay? You've been quiet." I turned my gaze to the window, watching the city blur past. "I'm fine." He sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "I know Mia being hurt must have reminded you of the past. But you don't have to keep everything bottled up. I'm here for you." I nearly laughed. He was here for me? The words I had overheard last night echoed in my mind. As long as Mia is happy, I don't care what happens to me. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed his concern was real. But I did know. And I refused to be deceived again. "Brandon," I said, my voice steady, "pull over." He blinked, confused. What? Pull over. Hesitating, he did as I asked, steering the car to the side of the road. The moment we stopped, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the night air. I didn't bother waiting for him to question me. I simply walked. Leah. Brandon called after me, his footsteps quick behind me. Wait. What's wrong? I stopped, turning to face him. The streetlights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the concern in his eyes. Concern for me? Or for the illusion of me? I just need some air, I said, forcing a small smile. You don't have to follow me. His brows furrowed. Leah, talk to me. Did something happen? Yes, I wanted to say. Everything happened. The past 7 years happened. You happened. But I only shook my head. I'm just tired. I'll see you tomorrow. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue. But eventually, he nodded. Okay. Just, don't stay out too late. It's not safe. I gave him one last glance before turning away. The sound of his car starting up and driving off filled the silence behind me, but I didn't look back. I walked for what felt like hours, allowing the cold wind to clear my thoughts. By the time I reached my apartment, exhaustion weighed on my limbs. Yet, sleep refused to come. Instead, I spent the night finalizing the legal paperwork to erase myself from this life. A new name. A new identity. A new future. The final piece of my plan was in place. I would disappear. And no one would ever find me again. The morning light filtered through my curtains, casting soft patterns against the walls of my apartment. I sat at my desk, staring at the neatly stacked documents before me. Every detail had been arranged meticulously. My new identity was secured, my finances carefully transferred, and every trace of my past existence was being erased. It was a surreal feeling, to knowingly walk away from everything I had ever known, to become someone else entirely. But this wasn't about running away in fear. It was about reclaiming my life. My phone buzzed. A message from Brandon. Brandon, good morning, love. Are you feeling better today? I stared at the words, the casual endearment, the lie of it all. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have responded with warmth. Instead, I typed a short reply. Me, I'm fine. Just a little tired. I silenced my phone before he could respond. My eyes drifted to my suitcase, already packed and waiting by the door. A small part of me wondered if they would even notice I was gone. Would they search for me? Would they care? I wasn't naive enough to believe that Adam or my parents would. They had made it clear years ago where their priorities lay. But Brandon, would he feel anything real? A bitter laugh escaped me. Even if he did, it wouldn't change anything. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. I continued going through the motions, carefully dismantling my past while keeping up appearances. Brandon remained oblivious, though I caught him watching me sometimes, a flicker of hesitation in his gaze. As if some part of him sensed the shift, the distance I was putting between us. Mia, on the other hand, was radiant as ever. Her injuries, though minor, had become an excuse for even more attention, more doting from the people around her. And Brandon, no matter how he tried to reassure me, his concern for her never wavered. It didn't matter. Nothing did anymore. The final step was at hand. The night before my departure, I stood outside, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I should have felt nervous. Maybe even sad. But all I felt was relief. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang. Brandon. I considered ignoring it. But after a pause, I picked up. Leah, his voice was soft, uncertain. Are you busy? No, I said simply. A beat of silence. Then, can I come over? I hesitated. What was the point? Brandon, please, he cut in. Just for a little while. I feel like we haven't talked much lately. I miss you. Lies. All of it. But I let out a sigh, pretending to relent. Fine. 30 minutes later, Brandon stood at my door, holding a small bag in his hands. I brought your favorite snacks, he said with a sheepish smile. Thought we could just spend some time together. Like before. Like before. As if anything could ever be the same. I let him in, watching as he settled on my couch, pretending that this was just another ordinary night. He told me about his day, about work, about Mia's recovery. I listened, nodding at the right moments, playing my role one last time. Then, as he was about to leave, he hesitated. Leah. He reached for my hand, his grip warm, familiar. Are we okay? I looked up at him, forcing a soft smile. Of course, I lied. We're fine. His shoulders relaxed, his relief evident. Good. I don't know what I'd do if I lost you. My heart clenched, not with love, but with the cruel irony of it all. By this time tomorrow, I would be gone. And he would never see me again. Dawn arrived in silence. The city was still asleep, unaware that someone within it was about to disappear. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the suitcase by the door. It was strange, how something so small could contain the remnants of a life I was about to leave behind. I reached for my phone, checking the time. One last call to make. With a deep breath, I dialed the number I had memorized by heart. Miss Leah, a calm, professional voice answered almost immediately. Everything is in place. The boat will be waiting for you at the dock in 2 hours. Your flight documents have been secured. The island is ready. I exhaled. Thank you. Would you like a security escort? No. I can handle this. As I ended the call, my eyes landed on my phone screen. Dozens of unread messages from Brandon. The last one had been sent at 3:47 a.m. Brandon, Leah, are you awake? I locked my phone and tossed it onto the bed. I didn't owe him a response. 2 hours later, I stood at the dock, watching the boat sway gently against the wooden pier. The wind was crisp, carrying with it the scent of salt and freedom. Lucas stood by the railing, his hands tucked into his pockets. When he spotted me, his lips curled into a small smile. Ready? I nodded, stepping onto the boat. The engine roared to life, and as we pulled away from the dock, I turned back for one final glance at the city that had never been mine. The buildings stood tall, indifferent, as if my absence wouldn't even cause a ripple. I had spent years fighting for a place here, chasing after love, after recognition, after a family that had never wanted me. But now, I was done fighting. Say goodbye, Leah, Lucas murmured. I inhaled deeply. The air was lighter here, untainted by the weight of old wounds. Goodbye, I whispered. And then, I turned my back on it all. Back in the city, chaos erupted the moment they realized I was gone. Brandon had been the first to sense something was wrong. He had woken up uneasy, checking his phone, only to find his messages unanswered. By the time he arrived at my apartment, the reality had sunk in. It was empty. Every trace of me had been wiped away. The clothes, the books, the framed pictures, all gone. The place looked like it had never been lived in. Brandon stood in the center of the room, his hands shaking at his sides. She wouldn't just leave, he murmured. But even as he said it, the truth clawed at his throat. A hotel manager entered cautiously. Sir, I found this near the door. She handed him a small envelope. Brandon snatched it, his fingers trembling as he tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, my handwriting unmistakable. Don't look for me. His breath caught, his mind racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. I had planned this. And I was never coming back. Brandon had never felt such a hollow ache in his chest before. He stood in Leah's empty apartment, his fingers gripping the note so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath his grasp. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this had happened, how she had vanished without a trace. He reached for his phone again, dialing her number even though he knew it was useless. The automated voice message greeted him, the same cold, indifferent tone that had begun to haunt him since morning. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Brandon swallowed the lump in his throat, his heart hammering. He turned to the hotel manager, his voice unsteady. Did she say anything to anyone? Did she leave anything else? The woman hesitated. No, sir. She left in the middle of the night. No one saw her go. It's like she just disappeared. The words hit him harder than he expected. Disappeared. Leah had always been quiet, always moving in the shadows of others. He had never once considered that one day she would slip away entirely, out of his reach, out of his life. Brandon clenched his jaw and stormed out of the apartment, his steps heavy. He needed answers. Someone had to know something. He drove across the city, his mind a blur of desperate thoughts. There was one person who might have an idea where she went. Adam. Adam answered the door with a frown, his brows knitting together at the sight of Brandon standing outside his home, looking disheveled and frantic. Where is she? Brandon demanded without preamble. Adam's expression barely shifted. I don't know. Brandon scoffed, stepping forward, forcing Adam to hold his ground. Don't lie to me. You knew she was leaving, didn't you? Adam leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. And if I did? Would it have changed anything? The question struck deep. Brandon's lips parted, but no words came. Would it have? If he had known Leah was planning to leave, would he have done anything to stop her? Would he have tried harder to make her stay? Or would he have done exactly what he had always done, taken her presence for granted? She's really gone, Brandon murmured, the truth settling over him like a lead weight. Adam studied him, his eyes unreadable. Maybe she just finally decided to choose herself. Brandon let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. You think she's better off without us? Adam didn't hesitate. Yes. Brandon looked away, his jaw clenching. He had spent years thinking Leah would always be there, silent, patient, waiting. Now, for the first time, he realized just how wrong he had been. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was gone. Brandon stood outside Adam's door long after it had been shut in his face. The weight of Adam's words settled deep in his chest, pressing against his ribs like an iron vice. Maybe she just finally decided to choose herself. Brandon had never considered the possibility that Leah would simply leave, without a fight, without a word, without even looking back. She had always been the one who stayed. No matter how much he had overlooked her, ignored her, betrayed her trust, she had always been there. Until now. His hands clenched at his sides. No. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He wasn't going to lose her, not like this. The next day, Brandon exhausted every resource at his disposal. He had people checking airport records, surveillance footage, anything that could tell him where she had gone. But Leah had been thorough. No credit card trails, no flight bookings under her name. It was as if she had erased herself from existence. The realization sent a chill through him. She hadn't just left. She had made sure she could never be found. Desperate, he turned to the one person who might still be able to help. Mia. Mia sat on the plush couch in her apartment, flipping through a magazine as Brandon paced before her. I don't know where she is, Mia said, barely looking up. And honestly, I don't see why you care so much. Brandon stopped pacing, turning to glare at her. Because she's my fiancée, Mia. Mia scoffed, finally setting the magazine down. Was your fiancé, she corrected. Face it, Brandon. She left. You were just the consolation prize anyway. His fingers curled into fists. If you know something, Mia, tell me. Mia smirked, tilting her head. And if I do? What are you going to do about it? She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with something dark. You always did choose her over me. Even when you pretended otherwise. But guess what? It doesn't matter anymore. Because she chose to leave you. Brandon's patience snapped. Mia, for once in your life, stop playing games. Do you know where she is or not? Mia's smile faltered, and for a fleeting second, something akin to jealousy flickered in her eyes. Then she sighed, as if bored. No, Brandon. I don't. Brandon exhaled harshly, raking a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe she was lying, but deep down, he knew she wasn't. Mia had always been self-centered, but she wasn't a fool. If she knew where Leah was, she wouldn't be wasting time taunting him. He was back to square one. Mia watched him for a moment before shaking her head. You won't find her, you know. If Leah doesn't want to be found, she won't be. She's different now. She's not the same girl who used to follow you around, waiting for scraps of attention. Brandon swallowed hard. He didn't want to admit it, but Mia was right. Leah had changed. And for the first time in his life, he was the one chasing after her. Brandon left Mia's apartment feeling more restless than before. He had hoped, somewhere deep down, that she would slip, that she would reveal something that would lead him to Leah. But she hadn't, and now, he was once again left standing in the middle of a puzzle with no pieces to fit together. He got into his car and gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Think, Brandon. Where would she go? Leah was careful, methodical. She had planned this for months, maybe even years, and he had been too blind to see it. If she had taken such measures to ensure she wouldn't be found, then looking in the obvious places was pointless. He needed help. The sound of a coffee machine humming filled the small office. Trey, Brandon's longtime friend and private investigator, leaned against the desk, sipping his drink with mild amusement. So let me get this straight, Trey said, setting his cup down. Your fiancé, who was in love with Adam before settling for you, has now disappeared off the face of the earth, and you suddenly care? Brandon shot him a glare. She didn't settle for me. Trey raised a brow. Didn't she, though? He leaned forward. Listen, man. I'll help you find her, but you need to ask yourself, are you looking for her because you love her, or because you hate the idea that she left you? Brandon opened his mouth, then shut it. The question was a loaded one, and the answer was more complicated than he cared to admit. Just find her, Brandon said, his voice tight. Trey sighed and turned to his computer, typing quickly. Fine. Let's start simple. Bank records, travel logs, anything that shows movement. If she wanted to disappear, she would have erased a lot of her trail. But people always leave something behind. Brandon sat in silence as Trey worked, each keystroke another reminder that Leah had thought this through. She had wanted to be unreachable. But why? Was it just to escape him, or was there more? Minutes passed. Then an hour. Trey cursed under his breath, rubbing his temples. She's good. No bank activity, no flagged movements. Nothing in the system. It's like she never existed. Brandon's chest tightened. He had known Leah was meticulous, but this was different. It was as if she had anticipated every possible search method and blocked them before he could even try. Trey exhaled and tapped his fingers on the desk. But there's one thing she couldn't erase. Brandon looked up sharply. What? Trey smirked, turning the screen toward him. Airline manifests. Even if she used a new identity, the flight pattern would still leave breadcrumbs. And guess what? There's an unlisted flight from Beijing to a private dock in North America, booked under an alias with a matching profile to Leah. Brandon's pulse quickened. So she's in North America? Looks like it. And get this, her final destination isn't a city. It's an island. A privately owned one. Brandon's brows furrowed. A private island? Trey nodded. Yeah. And unless she suddenly became a millionaire overnight, someone helped her buy it. Brandon leaned back in his chair, realization dawning on him. She planned everything. A clean break. A new life. And she never intended for me to follow. But he wasn't done yet. Find out who helped her. And get me away onto that island. Trey let out a low whistle. You're really gonna chase her to the ends of the earth, huh? Brandon met his gaze, his expression unyielding. She ran from me. But she doesn't get to disappear without an explanation. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was chasing her because he loved her, or because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her forever. The wind howled as the private jet touched down on the isolated airstrip. Brandon's grip on his armrest was tight, his mind whirling with the weight of what he was about to do. He hadn't stopped moving since Trey uncovered Leah's location. North America. A private island. A secret life she had built, far from the world she left behind, and from him. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Would she be furious to see him? Or would she be indifferent, as if he no longer existed? The thought gnawed at him, but it didn't stop him from stepping off the plane. Trey had arranged for a boat to take him the rest of the way. The crew was discreet, their eyes careful not to ask questions. Brandon barely acknowledged them, his focus locked onto the dark horizon where the island lay hidden in the mist. She was there. He could feel it. The waves rocked the small vessel as it cut through the waters. The journey was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic splash of the ocean. Brandon stood at the bow, gripping the railing as the silhouette of the island came into view. It was breathtaking, lush greenery stretching into the distance, a grand villa perched at the highest point, its lights glowing softly against the encroaching night. She was living in paradise. Alone. And he was about to shatter that peace. The boat slowed as it reached the dock. A single lantern flickered on a wooden post, casting long shadows. No one came to greet him. He had expected that. With a steady breath, he stepped onto the pier. His shoes echoed against the wood as he moved forward, scanning the quiet surroundings. Then, he saw it. A man, standing at the top of the path leading to the villa. Tall, relaxed, arms crossed over his chest. His presence was calm, but there was no mistaking the warning in his posture. Brandon's stomach twisted. So Leah hadn't just left. She had moved on. Lucas Tran watched as Brandon approached, his expression unreadable. The island breeze ruffled his dark hair, but he didn't move, didn't blink, just observed the man who had once been a part of Leah's past. Brandon stopped a few feet away, his breath shallow. Where is she? He asked, voice tight. Lucas tilted his head slightly. You came a long way to ask a question you already know the answer to. Brandon's hands clenched. I need to see her. Lucas exhaled slowly, as if considering his next words carefully. She doesn't want to see you. The words struck deep, more painful than he was prepared for. He had spent weeks, months, searching for her, only to hear that she wanted nothing to do with him. He shook his head. I'll hear that from her. Not from you. Lucas sighed. That's not how this works. You think you can just show up and force her to talk? You don't get to demand anything from her, Brandon. Not anymore. Brandon took a step forward, his voice low and edged with frustration. I just need a few minutes. Then, if she tells me to leave, I will. Lucas studied him, then let out a slow breath. Fine. Brandon's chest tightened as Lucas turned and gestured toward the villa. But don't expect the reunion you're hoping for. Brandon didn't care. He was here. And soon, he would see Leah again. Whether she wanted him to or not. Brandon followed Lucas up the winding stone path toward the villa, his heartbeat a steady drum in his ears. The island was beautiful, untouched by the chaos of the outside world, but the serenity only heightened the storm raging inside him. He had spent weeks searching, chasing shadows of Leah, and now, he was finally about to see her. But would she even care? The villa loomed ahead, its architecture blending seamlessly with the island's natural beauty. Soft lights glowed through the windows, casting warm invitations that were not meant for him. Lucas stopped at the heavy wooden doors and turned, his face impassive. "I'll give you 5 minutes," he said, his tone even. "If she asks you to leave, you will. No arguments." Brandon exhaled sharply, nodding. It wasn't as if he had a choice. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped aside. "She's inside." Brandon hesitated, just for a moment, then crossed the threshold. The interior was just as stunning as the exterior, warm, inviting, yet unmistakably distant. The scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of the sea. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Leah. She sat near the large glass windows, her back straight, a book resting on her lap. The soft golden light bathed her in a way that made her seem almost unreal, as if she were part of the island itself. But it was her eyes, calm, unreadable, that sent a sharp pang through his chest. She had changed. Not just in appearance, but in presence. The Leah he had known would have been flustered, uncertain, maybe even hopeful at his arrival. But the woman before him was composed, detached. A stranger. She met his gaze, her lips parting slightly, but she didn't move. She didn't run to him. Didn't cry. Didn't react at all. "You found me," she said, her voice smooth, free of emotion. Brandon swallowed. "You didn't make it easy." "I wasn't supposed to." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. He took a tentative step forward, but her posture remained unchanged. "Leah, why are you here, Brandon?" she interrupted, tilting her head slightly, studying him. "Didn't I make it clear that I didn't want to be found?" His breath caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had thought about what he would say, how he would convince her to come back. But standing here now, with her looking at him as though he were nothing more than an inconvenient memory, he realized he had never truly prepared for this. "I needed to see you," he admitted. "I needed to talk." She let out a quiet exhale, closing the book in her lap. "There's nothing to say. You're wasting your time." His jaw clenched. "You just disappeared, Leah. No warning, no goodbye. Did I mean so little to you?" Her expression didn't falter. "Did I ever mean anything to you?" she countered softly. The words hit him like a physical blow. She stood, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. "You should go, Brandon. Whatever you came here hoping to find, it doesn't exist anymore." He took a step closer, desperate now. "Leah, please. Just give me a chance to explain." "No." The single word was firm, final. "I spent too many years waiting for things that never happened, for feelings that never existed. I won't do it again." Brandon felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't the Leah he had known. This was a woman who had already walked away from him long before he even realized she was gone. Lucas reappeared at the doorway, his presence a silent reminder that time was up. Leah turned toward the window, dismissing him without another word. Brandon lingered for a moment longer, but deep down, he knew he had lost her. For good. Brandon stood motionless in the dimly lit room, the finality of Leah's words settling like a weight on his chest. He had expected resistance, maybe anger, but not this cold detachment. Not this complete indifference. It was as if he had never been a part of her life at all. Lucas remained by the doorway, his gaze steady, waiting for Brandon to accept what had already been decided. Brandon swallowed hard. This isn't how this was supposed to go. Leah turned back slightly, her expression unyielding. And how was it supposed to go? I thought you'd at least want to hear me out. She sighed, folding her arms. What for? To hear another apology? To listen to excuses? I don't need any of that, Brandon. Not anymore. But no, she cut him off, her voice firm. I spent too long waiting for you to care. I wasted years thinking if I was patient enough, if I proved myself enough, you would finally love me the way I deserved. But I see things clearly now. You only came here because you lost control. Because I left on my terms. Brandon's jaw tightened, but he had no rebuttal. Because she was right. He had convinced himself that he needed to see her, to explain, to fix things. But deep down, it was his own pride that had been wounded. The idea that Leah had moved on without him, without needing him, had shaken something in him that he hadn't even realized was there. I don't hate you, Leah said after a moment, her voice softer now. I just don't feel anything for you anymore. And that's what hurts you the most, isn't it? Brandon exhaled sharply. The words stung, but he refused to let them break him. So that's it? After everything? Leah nodded. That's it. Lucas stepped forward, sensing the moment of closure. I think you've got your answer, Brandon. It's time to go. Brandon hesitated, taking one last look at Leah, at the woman he had never truly seen until now. And in that moment, he understood she was never coming back. Not to him, not to that life. He turned away without another word, walking past Lucas and out into the cool island night. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality, and with it, any lingering hope he had carried. For the first time, Brandon accepted what he had fought so hard to deny. Leah was gone. And she wasn't looking back. Brandon walked away from the villa, each step heavier than the last. The cool night air wrapped around him, but it did nothing to numb the dull ache settling in his chest. He had come all this way searching for something, redemption, closure, maybe even the chance to rewrite their ending, but Leah had shut the door on all of it. And she was right to. Lucas followed a few steps behind, his presence a silent reminder that this was over. There was no more argument to make, no more words that could turn back time. Leah had made her choice, and for the first time, Brandon understood that he had never really given her the chance to make one before. Reaching the dock, he saw the boat waiting for him, its engine humming softly against the stillness of the water. He stopped just before stepping on board, turning his gaze back toward the villa one last time. No lights flickered from the windows. No shadow of Leah standing to watch him go. She had already moved on. And now, so would he. The journey back to the mainland was silent. Trey was waiting at the airport, leaning against his car with a knowing look in his eyes. Didn't go the way you thought it would, huh? Trey asked as Brandon climbed into the passenger seat. Brandon exhaled, resting his head against the seat. No. It didn't. Trey nodded, starting the car. You gonna keep looking for her? Brandon shook his head. No. I found her. That was enough. The words felt strange on his tongue, but he knew they were true. There was no point in chasing someone who no longer wanted to be found. He had spent so long trying to make things right, when in reality, the only thing Leah had ever needed from him was the chance to leave without looking back. And now, she finally had it. As the car pulled onto the road, Brandon closed his eyes, letting go of the past with every mile that stretched between him and the island. For the first time in years, he was ready to move on, too. The days passed, and with them, the weight of Leah's absence settled into something quieter inside Brandon. It wasn't an ache anymore, it was acceptance. The kind that didn't come easily, but when it did, it brought a clarity he hadn't known he needed. Back in the city, his life resumed. Work meetings, obligations, a routine that should have felt familiar. But everything was different now. He saw things with fresh eyes, understanding for the first time how much of his life had been built on expectations rather than choices. Trey watched him closely, waiting for signs that he would unravel. But Brandon didn't. He didn't go searching again, didn't drown himself in what-ifs. He simply moved forward, one day at a time. At first, there were moments of temptation, late nights where his fingers hovered over his phone, itching to send a message that would go unanswered. But he resisted. Leah had made her choice, and he had to respect that. Slowly, the need to reach out faded. Instead, he focused on himself, on the parts of his life he had long neglected. Then, one evening, as he stepped out of his office, he caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd. At first, he thought he was imagining it, a ghost of a past that refused to fully disappear. But as she turned, the sunlight catching in her hair, he knew it wasn't a dream. Leah. She wasn't alone. Lucas was by her side, their steps unhurried, their conversation light. She laughed at something he said, her face relaxed in a way Brandon had never truly seen before. She looked free, like the weight of the past had finally lifted from her shoulders. Brandon stood frozen for a moment, watching from a distance. He could have walked up to her, could have said something, anything. But what good would that do? She had built something new, something outside of him. And for the first time, instead of feeling a pang of regret, Brandon felt something else. Peace. He didn't approach her. Didn't call out her name. Instead, he smiled softly to himself, turned in the opposite direction, and walked away. Leah had found her happiness. And finally, so had he. As he walked away from that moment, he realized how much he had changed. There was no anger, no bitterness, just an understanding that some things were meant to end. He had learned that love wasn't about possession, nor was it about winning or losing. It was about growth, about letting go when it was necessary. That night, as he sat by his apartment window looking over the city, he thought about all the things he had lost, and all the things he had gained. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel empty. Leah had given him something, even in her departure. She had shown him that life moves on, that new beginnings are possible, even after heartbreak. And perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere down the line, he would find love again, not in desperation, but in the quiet understanding that real love was never about holding on too tight. It was about knowing when to let go.